I'd like to welcome everyone and thank you all for joining us this evening. To those of you experiencing your first Criminal Justice Series event, welcome. To those of you who are returning for more, welcome back. I appreciate your continued support. My name is Rhea Kate Castronova, and I'm the president of Alpha Phi Sigma, the CU Denver Criminal Justice Honor Society. In 2017, we started an event series that includes panel discussions, speaker events, and other forms of dialogue on issues related to criminology, criminal justice, and the law. I'd like to take a minute to thank the students, faculty, and staff in the School of Public Affairs for their support, and as always, our Dean of the School of Public Affairs, Paul Teskey, for his help. I'd also like to thank our Marketing Director, Tula Wellbrook, as well as Z.D. Flynn, our Public Relations and Events Coordinator, for facilitating these events. Finally, I'd like to acknowledge our Criminal Justice Honor Society, Alpha Phi Sigma, for their role in helping put these events together. This evening's panel discussion focuses on crime trends in Colorado. I'll be moderating this panel. I'm going to ask questions to the panelists and keep time. The last 20 minutes of this evening's event is reserved for audience questions, so please feel free to ask panelists questions during that time. Crime is a concern held by the vast majority of people. The thought of losing one's life or that of a loved one to murder is of great concern, but the reality for too many in Colorado and the nation. The thought of someone breaking into our homes and taking our possessions robs us of more than tangible objects. Stealing our motor vehicles creates havoc in our lives and is more than an inconvenience. The media is replete with stories of those victimized in these ways and others. While being conscientious is important, it's equally important not to live in fear and to have a healthy understanding of our actual risk of violence, property, and substance abuse crimes. Providing that accurate understanding is the purpose of the report that we're going to be discussing tonight. The report provides details of violent property and substance use crimes for the state of Colorado and the 23 largest policing jurisdictions in the state from 2010 to 2021. It also provides discussions about the data used, the limitations and strengths of those data, and other important information about intelligently assessing these data. No single crime rate for Colorado can accurately depict the incredible variation in crime rates across time, across jurisdictions, and across types of crime. In some cases, crime rates have increased, and in others, crime rates have decreased. For example, rates of motor vehicle theft have increased from 2010 to 2021 across the state. Similarly, rates of fraud have increased over the same time period in much of Colorado. In contrast, however, rates of burglary have decreased from 2010 to 2021 for the vast majority of the state, as have DUI and narcotic-related crime. In other cases, crime rates have fluctuated over the period of interest. Criminal homicide rates were up for 12 of the 23 jurisdictions considered. The increase in those 12 jurisdictions was accompanied by increasing proportions committed with firearms. Early in the period considered, about half of homicides were committed with a firearm, whereas in 2021, more than 80% of murders and non-negligent homicides were committed with a firearm in Colorado. While comparing rates over time is important, it is important to also recognize that what may appear to be a dramatic increase or decrease in crime rates over time is often due to low crime counts. Therefore, while understanding rates is important, it's equally important to understand the counts associated with them. Our panelists this evening include Dr. Callie Rennison, a professor and former associate dean of faculty affairs here at the University of Colorado, Denver, and Dr. Sheila Huss, an assistant professor, clinical teaching track of criminal justice and the director of the Bachelor of Arts in Criminal Justice program at CU Denver School of Public Affairs. Dr. Rennison and Dr. Huss compiled and analyzed the Colorado Crime Trends report that will be discussed today. Joining them are two very important members of the Denver community. Craig Spingarn, who since 2013 has been employed as a crime analyst with the Denver Police Department, and Elise Schmelzer, am I saying that right, Elise? Okay, thank you, who is a safety reporter for the Denver Post, are here with us tonight. I'd like to begin by asking each panelist to briefly introduce themselves to you. Craig, do you mind starting us off?
Of course. My name is Craig Spingarn, and I've been a crime analyst with Denver Police Department since 2013, but I've been involved in law enforcement since 1994. I guess it's getting up there, almost 30 something years. So, I previously worked in Weld County, Adams County, Broomfield. So I have a little bit of experience. I also train other police agencies on how to analyze data and policing strategies.
My name's Elise. I'm the public safety reporter at the Denver Post. Been there since 2018, doing public safety the whole time. So I cover crime, violence, incarceration, drugs, public policy, kind of a wide variety of things around public safety.
Hi, I'm Sheila Huss. I am on the faculty in the School of Public Affairs. I teach primarily in the criminal justice programs, undergraduate and graduate. I direct the undergraduate criminal justice program, and like Rhea mentioned, I co-authored the Colorado Crime Report with Dr. Callie Rennison.
Thank you. So I'm Callie Rennison, professor at the University of Colorado, Denver in the School of Public Affairs. Before I was in academia, I worked at the US Department of Justice in DC at the Bureau of Justice Statistics, where I compiled the nation's crime numbers using primarily the National Crime Victimization Survey, but also data from the UCR and NIBRS, or as we call it now, the SRS, the Summary Reporting System. I want to call out a special shout out to Sheila for the work that she's done to pull this panel together, and it's fabulous.
Thank you. Craig and Elise, can you please speak to the benefits and challenges that you face in your respective positions when it comes to documenting and reporting crime data to the FBI and the public, respectively? And Callie and Sheila, can you describe your experience working with UCR, which is the Uniform Crime Report, and NIBRS, the National Incident-Based Reporting System, which, as you said, now goes by, is it SRS? SRS, in order to write the crime report?
Well, I'll go ahead and start. Personally, the challenge for me is collecting accurate and timely data, stressing accuracy over urgency, because a lot of times there is a quick need to get this information out, but we must pause to make sure the information that we're collecting is accurate and thorough and complete. The other challenge is what questions are being asked. So sometimes there's different data sets that will provide different types of information. Sometimes people want to know, for example, calls for service and looking at crime as through the lens of where officers are responding to calls. Well, that is different from where the crimes are occurring. And so we have a challenge of, at times, the most or the hot spot for sexual assaults is Denver Health. That's not where the sexual assaults are occurring, but that's where the hot spot is, because that's where the reports are being taken. And we have to make sure that we're not looking at our calls for service data to determine where the crimes are happening. We have to look at the offense location. So there's oftentimes corrections that we make to the data to make sure that it is accurate. The other challenge is to take this data, which is just all kinds of points and unstructured, and to come up with some kind of analysis to make it actionable. Because that's really what I do, is I have to take all of those numbers and all that information and develop some kind of actionable plan, a strategy to address them. And it usually requires looking at the data in greater detail than is ordinarily provided by a quick down and dirty grab of the data. For example, prior to 2019, if you would have asked somebody that worked in the Denver Police Department how many people were shot that year, they could not tell you with any degree of accuracy. Now, they could tell you how many victims of an aggravated assault firearm there were, but that bucket counts a lot more than just people who actually suffered a gunshot wound. If they're in a car and that car was shot or fired upon, the technical victim of that crime occurred, then it gets counted. But that's not a shooting victim. They didn't get shot by a gunshot wound. And so these are the types of challenges that we at the Denver Police Department are constantly trying to overcome, so we can develop greater responses and more effective responses to some of these problems and issues that arrive that we can see by analyzing the crime data. Some of the benefits that we have is by looking at these pieces of data in a more detailed fashion and closer, we can come up with a more targeted response and direct resources to where they're needed rather than randomly throwing out our resources. A friend of mine talks about random patrols equal random results, but focused strategies and focused proactive actions can then impact the crime rates. So that's little bit in a nutshell, I guess.
My work's built completely on the work that Craig does. I just learned 10 minutes ago that he's the one fulfilling my data request for the past couple of years. So my job then is to take all of that. He's made it so that I can understand it, and I have to make it so that everybody can understand it. And it's so, I can get kind of wonky in my head because it's super easy to want to like splice this data into a million different ways and like really drill down on what's happening. But my job is to do that, to be accurate and be specific without getting too dry, without losing people's attention, right? Like I want to talk about the aggravated assaults, and let's talk about who gets shot at in cars and who got shot and who didn't get shot and where they got shot and how that's changed over time, how that varies from Denver to Thornton, right? Like there's so many ways you can parse this. It's my job to take all of this and kind of make it into something that people can understand while resisting the urge to create like a single narrative, because it's never a single narrative. That's like one of the biases in the news industry, is that people want there to be one story or like one solution, one problem, and that's just not ever the case with crime. So that's kind of my challenge and what I do.
Yeah, so with the crime report, it's really interesting because we're looking at the state of Colorado and we're looking at the largest jurisdictions in Colorado. So it doesn't allow for that degree of specificity, but at the same time, we needed to be cautious about throwing out huge generalizations about trends, especially looking back. If the Uniform Crime Report was originally established so we could look at national crime trends, and it has evolved and been used in different ways that are not always entirely appropriate and can be misleading. As far as the experience working with the data that we use to analyze the report, it seems like Colorado does a really good job of gathering crime data. The state has pretty high participation among the jurisdictions in the state. So it's not required to report to what's now the SRS, but used to be the Uniform Crime Report. And so Colorado has a really high degree of participation, which is good. The numbers, they're publicly available on a website, and they were pretty easy to find and very straightforward to work with. It's as simple as a drop-down arrow. So you can look at the state of Colorado. It lists all of the jurisdictions. And then you also can choose crime type or specific crime. So you can look at all violent crime, all property crime, all substance abuse crimes. There's only 3, but like that category. Or you could look at the specific violent property and drug and narcotic offenses. So it was pretty straightforward from a data entry and analysis perspective.
Right. Exactly. UCR and NIVERS are relatively easy to work with, but the key is recognizing the nature of the data and the limitations of the data. And I just jotted down a few things, and those who've been in my class will have heard this. But number one, these are all voluntarily submitted. Nobody is given money to submit these data, so it's incomplete in some places, or in some places they submit information on some types of crimes and not others. For example, if you look at in the report and all the tables, Pueblo County or Boulder County didn't submit, I think, any data up to 2015. So that's a part of it. They are only crimes that are reported to the police, and we know from NCVS data that at best half of crimes are reported to the police, so they're incomplete that way. Also, units of analysis that Craig touched on are super important to think about with this, because for most of the FBI's data, using their definitions, these are incident-based. They are not victimization-based. So if you look at something and it says there were 50 calls, that could be the same person who made 50 calls. It doesn't mean 50 people were injured or 50 property crimes, et cetera. So that's important to know. Also, a really big one is people seem to get most excited about what we call street crimes, and that's pretty much what we're talking about. This doesn't say anything about environmental crimes. It doesn't say anything about white collar crimes, which there's far more of than what we're looking at here. So it gives a partial view into what's some people is that the way the rates are calculated in commuting and out commuting communities get different sorts of rates. If you're a community that has a low population, but you have a huge influx of people coming in during the day, the way that's calculated, you're going to end up with a higher rate than, say, a place everybody's leaving from. So that the context is really important. And then Craig also touched on this, and Sheila, maybe you, everybody, but worth underscoring. You can see it, you can see percentage change, but you've got to look at the counts underneath it, because are we going from 1 to 2 calls, or are we going from 1,000 to 2,000 calls? It makes a difference. And in some cases, while the percentage of a certain type of crime has increased, the actual rate of the crime has decreased. So you'd have to get into it and understand the context of the area, the nature of the area, to get full understanding of it. And that's the trick with it.
Like you said, the report showed that while some crimes are going up, the trends are nuanced and there is variation depending on the type of crime, the area, and the time period. How does each of you address some of those contextual issues in the work that you do?
Well, we will review data. It's interesting because we came up with a lot of the same conclusions as your report did. And we don't wait for that report to come out before we make changes or decisions. We're constantly doing that. So some of the things that we look at are reviewing the data both like spatially and temporally. So basically where they're happening, when they're happening, and take a look at patterns and commonalities and seeing if there's any factors that are contributing to these issues in those areas. Then we look at for the police department, we then look at a corresponding number of proactive actions by our officers. And a proactive action is when the officer isn't being sent somewhere on a call, it's the activity that they generate themselves, self-initiated activities. And we want those to be taking place in the areas that need the resources. And so when we have, for example, we knew a long time ago that we had an auto theft problem. We didn't have to wait to be ranked number one. And it's not something we're very proud of, but it's something that consistently it rings through almost to the point where we have to start thinking about other issues because we can't become a single issue agency. But we look at that issue and decide, are our officers looking at how the cars are getting stolen? Are they being left running? Do they have the keys? Are there certain areas in which they're getting stolen more frequently? Of course, the brand, make, and model of the car made a big difference. So we look at all these little nuances to kind of decide how to address it. But from our point of view, it's how do we solve the problem rather than, what is the data really telling us? It's going to guide our response. And then we have to take a step back and then measure what we done to decide if what we did was effective. If it was, great. If not, we have to start over and try something else because we don't want to continue to do something if it's not being very effective. I hope that answered the question.
Definitely. That was perfect. Thank you.
I think some of my favorite kind of frames or context I try to add is I always try to at least include some temporal analysis. It's like, okay, homicide rate has been really elevated the past couple of years. How does that compare to the 90s, right? Like people, especially right now when we're in like an election season, people like to make all kinds of claims about crime and safety, especially in Denver proper. People are like, wow, I've never felt so unsafe in Denver before. I'm like, well, statistically, you're wrong. So I think that's always important to kind of provide that like longer context, especially when people are using it for elections. And then I also like to really, for me, I think the general categories of like property crime and violent crime are almost useless. Like it's helpful buckets, but it doesn't really tell us anything. Like I did an analysis a couple of years ago, and I was looking at violent crime in Denver, Colorado Springs, and Aurora. And in Denver and all three had like a rise in violent crime. But in Denver and in Colorado Springs, if you took out aggravated assaults, it was flat. So it's not that you have a violent crime problem, you have an aggravated assault problem. And so your solutions are going to be different if you're talking about shootings or aggravated assaults than if you're going to talk about robberies, right? Two kind of different things going on there. So I really like to kind of like drill down further into that. And then when I go even further, like if we pick homicides, I write like a homicide shooting analysis every year. That's when I ask Craig for really detailed data. And I'm like, give me the addresses, relationship between people, age, race, demographics, kind of all of the above. And then you can do even further specific, like more specific reporting, more specific solutions finding, because at the end of the day, journalism is part of the thing we do is look for solutions, or at least ask people smarter than ourselves, what should we be doing here?
So for me personally, in the scope of my work, a few of my interests are in laws and policies and violence prevention and intervention. And if you think about the very nature of nuance, that kind of suggests that larger quantitative patterns should be supplemented by additional specific knowledge from law enforcement, media, from local communities themselves about the causes of crime, about the nature of crime, about spatial and temporal patterns. And a lot of these contextual issues drive policy agendas and policy design. And I think that, in the scope of my research questions are, and my research interests are framed by some of the emerging and specific trends when it comes to crime and violence. And then in the teaching part of my job, the very classes I choose to teach often are driven by what's going on with crime trends or lack of knowledge about different crime trends. Like I see a couple of people smiling. Right now I'm teaching a class, it's called Fatal Violence Against Indigenous Women. But the idea for that class basically emerged from the missing and murdered Indigenous women crisis. And so just the selection of classes, the course materials that we include, the way that discussions are framed in classes, all can be driven by what is going on in the criminal justice system and when it comes to crime trends at any given point in time.
Great. For me, the classes that I teach, I kind of view my number one goal is teaching students and others to be critical consumers of information and to think about this, to understand the importance of context. A really important point about these crime data is they are data. They can't tell us why. They don't answer the questions why. They just give us what's going on, and it requires understanding of a particular area or talking to the law enforcement agency. They may have seen a particular type of crime increase, but it's because they've focused resources on looking at that, and so the counts are going to go up. It could be that a particular law enforcement agency has spent a lot of time developing better relationships with the community around them, and the community now feels more at ease to contact them. So it's not always bad news. It's also understanding, again, the context. What's the areas like characteristics in terms of education, income, single-headed households, age, and all of these things that are going to contribute to it. And then one of the big things in this report, we did talk a little bit of why we think certain things might have happened, but that's us speculating. But looking at COVID is so important during especially the shorter trends of this. A lot of what we see, I think, is due to COVID. People were home more, burglaries went down. Is that a surprise? Not really. So I think that that's a big part of it, is just trying to, other than education, kind of screaming into the void with journal articles and books about this stuff, but sometimes I don't know that anybody actually hears it.
Thank you. While crime trends are complex, as each of you sort of mentioned there, and generalities that could cause a moral panic should be avoided. Locally in Denver and in many other jurisdictions, we are seeing a rise in violent crimes. What role might you play in your job in addressing that problem, or how do you think the rising violence should be addressed?
Well, this is something that I spend quite a lot of time on. I'm currently assigned to major crimes in homicide. And so I am frequently trying to take this information, take the data, look at the investigations, and come up with ways that we can develop a strategy to address some of these issues. The first thing that occurred is we needed to know, just like Elise indicated, where are they happening? When are they happening? And we came up with taking the data and aggregating it and looking at where crime hotspots for non-fatal shootings and homicides occur. Because frankly, the difference between a non-fatal shooting and a homicide is access to medical care and how quickly you get to medical care. And we're very fortunate to have Denver Health, which is one of the best trauma centers in the country, frankly. And they have reduced our homicide rate by saving a lot of people. But we need to understand where and when and why these things are happening. And so we take a look at the data, we take a look at causal factors. That's one of the hardest things I have to do is take a look at an active homicide investigation and figure out why and what was the causal factor. And again, we can't just put every reason, because there's very specific reasons why people do what they do. but we have to put them in buckets and categories, and so we developed some categories that were we thought would best aid us in doing our jobs. Then sometimes when you're looking at answering some of the questions from the data, it's more difficult and it's not as simple. I'll use domestic violence and a domestically violent homicide. So if in that incident someone intervenes and they kill the perpetrator of the domestic violence, is that a domestic violence homicide? Because the victim of the domestic violence didn't die. Someone intervened and killed the person. We made a decision that the third party domestic violence fatality applies, and we specially note that. But then when that data is reported, and let's say we come up with 10 of those people weren't the victim of the ongoing domestic violence. Maybe 4 of them were the perpetrator. This is just the nuances of all of these pieces of data that cannot possibly be captured by these bins. And we're fine with the bins, we're fine with the crime reports because they educate us, but the business of addressing the problem, sometimes you have to take a closer look at what's going on. So we develop relationships with partners and stakeholders in the process of looking at these areas. We have these persistently violent locations, which historically have had a disproportionate number of violent incidents occurring. And we use the data to identify those. And then we make partnerships with the community, people that are stakeholders. And we decide that, the police department can't do it by themselves. We need the community, we need partners, stakeholders, we need the press to help educate the people. And so we address them that way and hopefully come up with a plan to make sure that police resources are in the areas that these incidents are taking place. They're not on a stretch of road that nothing ever happens, looking for that one speeder because it's easy to catch a speeder. That to me is wasted resources. Those people need to be in those areas where they're needed. And one of the ways we do that is we look at calls for service before and calls for service after. And we talked earlier about the differences between calls for service and crime numbers. Calls for service is the citizen requires a police response. And we have also self-initiated activities by officers. And we found by reviewing our data that as we increase self-initiated activity in an area, the citizen-initiated calls for service drop. And to me, that was a way to measure prevention, which is always a difficult thing to get at. And so we look at those and we try to replicate it. We try to find a way to do that in these areas to address these violent issues the best we can, because it's really hard to address root causes of crime. That's a much bigger piece to kind of attempt to break off. But if we can make sure that we're in the places where these things are occurring, just the presence, the visible presence of a police officer can sometimes deter the behavior or prevent it from escalating.
Yeah, I feel like my job is mostly the informing people. It's educating people without scaring people. It's showing the human impact of these crimes because it's very real, and like honoring that without exploiting the people who are being impacted and without scaring people once again. That's kind of my job. And to also on the other side is an accountability piece, and to make sure that our elected leaders and the powers that be are doing their job, or doing the best they can. It doesn't always, it's not always like an aggressive thing. I'm not like, Craig, why aren't you guys doing this, this, and this? I'm like, okay, have you guys heard about this? This is what Seattle PD is doing. Is this something we've considered here? And just kind of asking those questions repeatedly, sometimes over a series of years. I'm thinking specifically like around youth gun violence. I wrote a series of stories 2019, now a while pre-pandemic, but I was like, hey, this is a problem. This is a problem. City started doing some things. It's like, okay, we did that. Has anything changed? And you just kind of, you're here long enough, you just kind of keep asking those questions. And it's a progressive thing. It just takes time. Change is slow, especially when we're talking about root causes of crime, which are all the big social health determinants.
So the biggest piece of my job is being an educator. And so that, as far as the role that I play in my job, I think, is through educating students about the complexities associated with violence and the implications of violence. So that is in my classes. I regularly teach a violence in society class. I teach juvenile violence, the fatal violence against Indigenous women. Even in a class like capital punishment, we go over the implications of violence on the victims and their families. And so I hope that students take from my classes and our undergraduate program as a whole, the skills and knowledge into their own careers and use that to help prevent crime, violence, and recidivism. The research end of my job, I've been involved in a couple of projects with the city of Denver. One was on youth violence prevention, and the other is on the feasibility of establishing an Office of Neighborhood Safety. And through both of those projects, I've also had opportunities to partner with the community. So the direct partnership was with the city of Denver, but in both projects, I had opportunities to work with the communities. And I hope that those collaborative projects and more like them also will give me an opportunity to directly make a difference in crime and violence in certain areas of the city.
Right. I just wanted to reemphasize the purpose of this report and why we wrote it. And it wasn't so much to put out endless tables of numbers, which were great fun nonetheless, but it was more about educating on the nuances of crime data and what it means and being a critical consumer. And one of the things I hope people take away from actually the written part of the report, if you don't want to look at all the tables, which are awesome, is that one statement cannot summarize what's happening in the state. And because it's important when we talk about violent crime is up in the state of Colorado, that may be true, but as Elise noted, if you look at what it is, it's aggravated assault. Okay, and in half of the jurisdictions we looked at, homicide is down. So that's the part that I really wanted to get across. And especially during a political season, we saw what I think is the misuse of these things for fear mongering and scaring people and trying to get them to vote a particular way and putting out crime numbers and claiming that it means X when the numbers cannot tell you that. So part of my job as an educator, and what I keep trying to say, is to avoid the fear mongering, moral panics, and to try to teach the public how to look at this stuff in a way that it doesn't change the way you live in an unnecessary way. It doesn't serve the public well just to be scared all the time.
Thank you. And you just now touched on this, Callie, but from your perspective, how do crime trends impact public fear? In other words, as crime trends go up or down, does fear or crime follow a similar pattern? And Elise, if you wouldn't mind speaking specifically to the role of the media, I know you touched on that a little bit, but just again, looking at that pattern of crime trends going up or down, whether or not crime follows that same pattern, if you could expand on that, that'd be great. Thank you.
Well, I do think that as crime increases, people do experience a fear of crime. I am more of a firm believer that an individual's personal experiences shape the perception they have of crime rather than numbers or anything like that. The biggest example I could give was I was asked to go speak to a neighborhood organization, and they wanted to ask questions about crime. And so I spent some time preparing, and I was ready with all kinds of information about violent crime, robberies, homicides, aggravated assault, shootings, and I had all this information, about what we were doing about it and how they were going to see a higher police presence in their neighborhoods. And when I got there, does anyone know what they were the most concerned about when I got there to talk to this community?
Porch pirates.
Porch pirates, people speeding through the neighborhood, and people playing their stereos too loud. That overwhelmingly, these quality of life issues is what people were really, really concerned with, because that was what impacted them. Thankfully, most people aren't going to be impacted by violent crime or homicides or aggravated assaults, but they are impacted by porch pirates. They're impacted by speeders. people playing loud music, and that's what they want. They want those things addressed. And so, you know, it's also true that I've been places and speaking, and all they can talk about is this one incident. And they believe that just because of this one incident, everything is violent, everything is scary, everything is awful. You know, and I want to tell them, well, that one incident had a root cause that was very specific. It wasn't going, the risk of that wasn't going to spread anywhere else because this person had a problem with this person and this person solved the problem. For him anyway, you know, not for the other person and not for our community, but it wasn't a problem or a danger to the community. And so it is very important. For example, at one point, everyone was very concerned about robberies going up. And when we explained that a lot of the robberies that occur is someone that was shoplifting an item and the clerk tries to stop them, well, then they're using force to take the item, which is now a robbery. And it's not stick 'em up kind of thing. And the majority of the robberies that take place in Denver are the type of a shoplifter trying to go out and someone in loss prevention trying to prevent them, and there's a struggle and boom, it's a robbery. And we spend a lot of time trying to educate businesses that let them take the item because it's, you know, the risk to the community, the risk to your employees is not that great, but it generates a very scary crime statistic because robbery is way scarier than shoplifting. Am I right? And the other thing that I wanted to bring up is some crime statistics are self-generating. And what do you mean by that? Well, you have to catch a shoplifter to have a shoplifting statistic. And so if you have a loss prevention team that's really good, they're going to catch a lot of shoplifters and you're going to have a high rate of shoplifters. If you have one that's not very good and they don't really care and they don't even know what's being stolen, well, we don't have a shoplifting problem. Sometimes that is applied to drugs, fentanyl. If we didn't stop cars and try to get in there and seize drugs, we wouldn't have a fentanyl problem. If people weren't ODing on them, we wouldn't have a problem. But to go out there and no one's calling the police saying, my dealer ripped me off, you know, come get him. He didn't give me my full gram, whatever. These are generated by police activity. And so when you see a dip in proactive action, sometimes you will see a dip in some of these public and other type of offenses, weapons violations, you know. And so the more we're out there being proactive in neighborhoods, sometimes we can drive the crime rate up in these categories. So it's very nuanced. I think and I'm glad that this report gets published and we have this ability to have this discussion about it because I think it's a very good and healthy thing.
Public perception of crime is just like, it's so fascinating to me because I talk to all kinds of different people about it. Like the national polling shows that there's not really a link between people's perceptions of safety and actual crime rates. Like people are feeling more unsafe, like that's what that line looks like, but the crime rate's kind of all over the place down here, does not mirror each other. When I go out in the world and I talk to people, you just never really know what you're going to get. Like you can get different answers from people on the same block. Denver Police has a hotspot program where they're doing kind of concentrated police and community work, where they have the most gun violence. And so I went out to one of these neighborhoods, knocked on all the doors. I'm like, hey, do you know you live in a gun violence hotspot? And like 80% of the people were like, nope, didn't know that. You know, then I talked to them like, do you feel safe here? Like, you have bars on your windows. Why do you have bars on your windows? And ask those kind of questions. Yeah, all kinds of different stuff from all kinds of different people. There's no like single takeaway. I think it depends a lot on your own personal life experiences, right? Like if your brother got shot down the block, you'll feel differently than if you didn't. Or even if like your car window got broken out and something stolen from your car, you're going to feel less safe. It also depends like what kind of media you consume, like in media broadly, not just news media, but you know, television, movies, next door, exactly, exactly where I was going to go.
Yeah.
And I do think it's like a broader challenge for my industry, for journalists, to compete with Nextdoor, to compete with Facebook groups, where things are free and whatever information you want is out there, you can find out. But there's no one doing the fact checking. There's no one saying like, well, in 1995, things were worse. Like you don't have that. No one's doing that kind of context that I try to include, and a lot of journalists try to include in their reporting, or should try to include in their reporting. I mean, it's a complicated landscape, and sometimes you guys were talking earlier about shouting into the void. Sometimes it feels like you're shouting into the void because no one really wants to deal with those complexities. But I do think there is a general desire to really understand what's going on, because people want to feel safe. When I tell people I'm a crime reporter, they're like, oh my God, are you afraid? I'm like, actually, no, I'm not afraid at all. I'm like, I'm out there. I'm like, I'm at the shooting scenes and stuff. I'm talking to the people whose loved ones get killed. And there's like, the only place in Denver I would not feel safe is Lodo when the bars get out. That's it. Like, knowledge is power. I believe that. And that's what I hope to do with journalism.
Yeah, so broadly, like Elise said, crime trends don't seem to have a very strong connection to fear of crime, but I think that there sometimes can be an indirect relationship. So like in the 1980s, juvenile violence was increasing, and there was a lot of language around like out of control kids, references to kids as sociopaths. It was actually a criminologist who coined the term super predator, referring to juveniles. And that did seem to increase fear in the public. I also think that, like both Craig and Elise mentioned, local problems can impact fear in the people who live and work in the spaces that those problems impact. And then I also think that people have generalized fears of stranger violence, like their kids being kidnapped or themselves or a loved one getting murdered. And I think that those generalized fears are probably a function of what they're watching on TV, reading on social media, Nextdoor, listening to on podcasts. Like Elise pointed out, there's a lot of different ways that we consume information these days. And I think that choices that we make when it comes to consumption of information can impact public fear of crime.
Right. I'm probably not going to say anything new because, as you noted, nationally, the risk of being a victim of crime and the fear of it, they're not related whatsoever. And there is a lot of research out there talking about the sort of media that somebody consumes and how it can affect somebody's fear of crime. I've spent time wondering that I think some people like, or they're comfortable in being afraid of being a victim of crime because you can show them facts and it doesn't matter. If I had $1 for every time my parents tried to give me a gun because they're really afraid about crime and me being a victim, and I'm like, I'm doing the nation's crime numbers. It's okay. I'm not scared. But it's really funny. Or you can tell people, in these last many months that, have you seen the burglary rates in this state? They're really great. This is good news. Yet they'll hear that and then turn around and talk about other things that are scarier. So I think there's some interesting psychological part of it too that I haven't quite figured out. So maybe there's a psychologist in the audience who can shed some insight on it. It's so strange. But again, just continue screaming into the void about this is what it is. This is what it is. And maybe before I die, it'll change a little.
Thank you very much for sharing all your thoughts and opinions and facts. At this time, I'd like to open it up to audience questions. Dee Dee does have a microphone, can come around to you if you've got a question, a comment, maybe a funny joke.
Okay, perfect. I will say we have a few questions from Zoom, so I'll get us started with a question from Zoom. Would you talk about the impact of behavioral health conditions on the justice system? Particularly, they write, when a mentally ill person who is obviously out of control lashes out on law enforcement and is charged and sent to jail.
Well, I believe the largest mental health facility in the United States is Rikers Island, because there are no large mental health hospitals anymore. And I do think that question is an issue that large cities are dealing with all over this country. And Denver started to do something very proactive a few years ago, and that is responding to some calls for service with a mental health technician to assess the situation and get them into areas of where they can get help. And We have dedicated units that don't even include a police officer. They're just mental health workers that answer police calls for service that have been classified that this is the type of problem. Then we have a whole nother set of a mental health caseworker that rides with an officer. So some of those incidents that are a little more dangerous that we just can't send people to, that they're with that officer to help facilitate, because it is a real issue. And with people experiencing homelessness in Colorado and elsewhere, that degree of mental health illness in the community is high. And so it is important that we do more proactive and novel approaches to address this problem, because you can't just put them in a facility and expect them to get better. You have to actually get them to the help they need.
Yeah, I don't have anything to add to that.
Yeah.
Yep, not enough capacity.
Yeah.
It's like we have solutions,
Right,
but we don't have enough, with the money is not going to those solutions. We have mental health courts,
right.
but they help maybe a couple dozen people a year, depends on the jurisdiction. When really there's probably a need for hundreds, if not thousands of those kind of slots.
Okay, sorry. So I just want to take this opportunity to say too, that a lot of times when people talk about individuals who have mental health issues, they think about them as offenders. And I want to point out that the research is very clear that their risk of being victimized is higher than those who don't suffer from these sorts of illnesses. So I just want to take this opportunity to put this out there. That's the fact.
That's very true.
Mhm.
Thank you all.
Thank you for your presentation. It's really quite interesting. I have a short question and then one longer. The short question is, what percentage of homicides actually end up with someone getting convicted? And then my second question was, I watched Next Door and it's just like a stream of craziness. And I wonder if anybody's done studies, because I have the sense, and I think Dr. Rennison alluded to it, that people are pushing a political agenda. They're like, look at this crime happening in our neighborhood. Joe Biden is not dealing with this. And I think there might be a really interesting study to see if someone else is president, you don't see that kind of thing going on. Is there anybody doing studies of sort of intentional political manipulation through Next Door and stuff? It certainly seems that way to me.
Well, I'll answer the homicide question. The easier question is how many of them are solved in Denver. And as of today, in 2022, we have solved 80% of Denver's homicides. The national average hovers right around 50 to 60%. And so we're very proud of that number. At the same time, very sad that we have that many opportunities. The other question is a little bit more difficult to get at, because as far as how do you answer that? Because we just got a conviction yesterday on a 2018 case. So it is very difficult, but we are beginning to collect some data on that. It's almost a better question for the DA's office, I think, and more appropriate. But I think that we're getting better at it, for sure.
You're also in luck tonight because I believe we have somebody here who's very familiar with Next Door data. Am I correct? Do you care to share?
Well, it's difficult to share right now.
One second, Mary.
Oh, microphone. Thank you. So my PhD student here, Megan Parker, and I are working on a study right now. We're analyzing data. So we're right in the midst of the data analysis. It's fascinating what you can see on Nextdoor. And we'll be presenting the results of the study next week in Washington, D.C. at our national conference for the Academy of Criminal Justice Sciences. And then hopefully the paper will be published. That's our goal there. But yes, and this is just the beginning exploratory step in pulling data from Nextdoor that's related to crime and perceptions of policing and perceptions of safety. There are so many research studies that could be done. I don't have a lot of years left, but I could spend the rest of my career just doing Nextdoor studies and the different comparisons between rural and urban. So Megan and I are both really excited about it. Megan, do you want to say anything about the research? I think you should.
So when I was going through all the data, we initially pulled 100 purposeful sampling for the data. So we chose those posts that focus primarily on crime. We did 100, and then we also analyzed all the comments that originated under them. So initially, the initial posts are incredibly interesting. However, the comments that are under those posts are by far more intriguing, especially in regards to politics and what our law enforcement officers are doing. So initially, what I found is it's a political problem. It is a government problem. We are not putting individuals in jail long enough. However, I would like to respond to these individuals, which I don't, because I think that would be unethical. However, asking them, well, what is the solution? So are we going to put someone who steals a package off of someone's porch in jail for 25 plus years? Because some of those individuals definitely think so. Also, they have that retribution aspect that, well, if they come to my house, well, I'll just get a bat. So is that the solution? Because they can't rely on officers to come to their actual house to conduct an investigation, because typically officers, they are very strained right now. We're seeing it where officers or even agencies, they cannot rely on applicants to actually join the police agencies or go through the whole becoming an officer. So where do we devote our resources to? Is it these low-level crimes that individuals are experiencing, but making these people feel unsafe in their communities? Or do we devote it to more murder cases, which we don't see on Nextdoor app? I think out of our Nextdoor app post, or the initial post, we saw maybe 6 gun problems or gun violence. Typically, they're going to be your minor crimes. They're going to be your traffic violations that are being reported, and then also a lot of porch pirates, especially during the Christmas season. And it's like, how do we handle this? Do we devote a lot of law enforcement opportunities or resources to it, or do we take a step back?
I want to ask you guys what sort of self-care you're engaged in after reading all of that.
We call it martini night. I just want to say it looks as though Nextdoor is neighborhood watch on steroids.
Yeah.
So yeah, so look forward to seeing that. It's a fun research project.
Thank you.
And for the benefit of those on Zoom, and then also for the recording, would you both mind to just introduce yourselves for anybody who couldn't see you on the video?
My name is Mary Dodge, and I'm the director of the Masters of Criminal Justice program. I've been, well, apparently I didn't know this until I got an invite, but 25 years at the School of Public Affairs this year. So that's amazing to me because the time flies so fast. It's such a great place to work and such a great job. Research, meeting wonderful people. So that's me.
So I don't know where to look, but turn around. Oh, perfect.
You might keep missing the camera,
But okay. All right, so my name's Megan Parker, and I'm a first-year PhD student here at the School of Public Affairs. I am also an instructor in our criminal justice program. I'm currently teaching intro, and I do a lot of research with Dr. Mary Dodge.
And Megan has a new publication coming out in April. Yeah, I just found out.
Thank you. And for those of you who don't know, in particular my grandparents who are watching from home, Nextdoor is an app where you can report on what's going on in your neighborhood. So, for example, my uncle and his girlfriend, they live in Highlands Ranch in Denver, respectively. They like to play a game where they compare what's going on Nextdoor. And in our neighborhood, it's usually like, oh, I saw a cat today. Here's a photo. And in Denver, there's a guy on my porch again. So, Grandma, it's an app where you can share what's going on in the neighborhood just to clear things up for you.
Perfect. We'll throw it back to Zoom for another question. There's a comment. Is there any attempt or desire to build a more robust data set, assuming consent, privacy, and other issues can be overcome on crime rates by trying to work with public defenders, willing private defense attorneys, and other stakeholders to get a better understanding of why a crime occurs? And just to give some anecdotal background, this person wanted to share over their career in criminal defense work and now as an academic police/prosecutor, explanations seem to be rooted more in what they want to be true.
I'll tackle that a little bit. I mean, there are a lot of data sets out there that focus on a lot of different things. For example, we're talking about crime here. These aren't NIBRs and the SRS are not the only data sets out there that focus on it. The NCBS has some other really great advantages. That is, we go to people's homes and talk to everybody age 12 or older in the homes about any property or personal crimes that have happened. This is how we know what percentage of crime is reported to the police, whereas this information we're talking about here is only what does get reported to the police. If you go to the Department of Justice, Office of Justice Programs, and the Bureau of Justice Statistics and use their search engine, they have tons of information on pretty much every aspect of the criminal justice system. And this person might find their answers. It's not my area of expertise. So I don't think I can answer very specifically what they're asked about, but this is what I would suggest to a student is go dig around there. Also, they have, I think it's Ask BJS at bjs.gov or something like that. And you can ask that specific question and they can point you to data that's available to help you answer that or let you know that it doesn't exist. So
For the annual crime report, we'll likely continue to analyze the same data sets because that is what's available and suits the purpose of the annual crime report. The one thing I would like to develop in future editions of the report would be some of the correlations with census data. So looking at if you see an increase in crime in a certain area, was there a corresponding increase of, let's assume that the crime is typically committed by young men. Was there an increase in the population of young men in that area? So I would like to do more with those types of correlations. And those data sets, so the American Community Survey can be matched with the data, the crime data that we looked at. So probably not adding like the National Crime Victimization Survey because that's a different data set, different purpose. But I think that the American Community Survey would be a good supplement and we would be able to do more with that.
Thank you for sharing.
Hi, I don't know how to, those were all great questions. So I'm going to try to follow this up quickly. What ethics, we talked a lot about educating the public today from each of you guys' perspectives. So what ethics do you guys each abide by? Furthermore, how do you combat bias in each of your guys' organizations and groups?
I can go first. Journalistic ethics are shockingly not something that are written down. But like I said earlier, like my personal ethics, and I think kind of the industry standard is provide as much information as you can with as much context as you can, honor the people you're writing about. Often I'm writing about like specific people, honor those people, especially, if they're victims of crime or loved ones of victims of crime. I treat them differently when I interview them than I treat the mayor. Like it's just different rule book, trying to honor their humanity and realizing that this is a story for me, but this is probably one of the more important things or like more crucial things that have happened in their lifetime. In news industry, there's a bajillion biases we have to fight against. So the ones that I think apply, some of the ones that I think apply mostly here is the bias towards speed. It's the breaking news cycle and trying to take a step back from that and say, maybe we don't need to go there yet. Maybe we can let that one go because we don't know enough information about this. So let's pause there. An interesting thing I've seen that is currently happening right now is stepping away from kind of this like decades old habit of reporting every single crime that happens. The newspapers a lot of newspapers still publish crime blotters. If you're in like a smaller town, you'll see it. It'll be like Joe Bob arrested for DUI last night, Joe Bob's aunt arrested for DUI the next day, like stuff like that. But especially in the internet age, it's like, what do we gain by that? And what harm do we do by that? And are we going to follow up on those cases later? Like Joe Bob is probably going to plea down. Like he might not be convicted of DUI. The case might get dismissed. Who knows? Like I think, and part of our ethics is what we've been trying to do. What I've been pushing for is that we should only report someone's name if we're going to follow up on that case and actually see what happens, which really limits us, like, because there's only two of us who really do the criminal justice side of things. We had like 90 something homicides in Denver last year. We get every year. I don't know. I will stop myself there. It's like a whole web. We can talk later.
I think that, the accuracy versus urgency comment that I led off with, one would think I'd be talking about a news show or the press or something, but I'm really not. I'm talking about our own, the police department's desire to quickly get something out, to be transparent, because Denver, believe it or not, is very transparent, and what we're trying to be as much transparency as we can. We have a lot of public-facing dashboards. We're one of the first in the country to put our officer-involved shootings public-facing dashboard. You can grab a lot of great data from it. But I remember sitting there, and command staff wants to know exactly what happened, and they want to, because they're going to push it out. And we're trying to say, well, we really don't know what happened. We think we know what happened, but thinking we know what happened and when we're sure what happened is very different. So us ethically, we can't just think we know what happened. We have to be sure. And the ethics come involved in when we're investigating someone. We put as much work into exculpatory evidence as we do damning evidence. So if I find something that's exculpatory, then I'll chase that down and we'll get it out there and we'll exonerate someone, and we get just as much satisfaction from that as we do identifying the suspect and getting a conviction, because then we can focus on the real person. We don't have to worry about this anymore. So I think I bet one would be surprised at the amount of people who are just as interested as making sure that if this person didn't do it, then we get them cleared as quickly as possible so we can move on. Bias. Denver doesn't use any kind of offender scoring system like some cities around this country do. They'll use an offender threshold analysis where they assign values to a person's involvement in the criminal justice system. For example, Denver does not do this, but some agencies will give a point score for an arrest, another for being a witness, another for being a victim, and they crunch all this data up and they come up with a list of people that are likely to be involved in criminal activities. Denver does not do that. We have been asked to do similar things like that, and the response is, if you can come up with a non-biased method of doing this, we would be interested, but there really is not, because the way crime data is, and the way the process is. So I'm proud to say that we don't engage in that kind of activity, but I do train police departments all over the country, and several of them will want help in fine-tuning their data model to come up with predictions on who they should be watching. And on my time here in Denver, we've never engaged, and our chief is very much against that.
So the research and teaching, ethics and research can mean anything from just being very transparent about what you're doing and, the impetus for the project, the limitations of the research. So there's kind of like the basic research ethics. The previous few projects that I've been actively involved in, to me, where I was really cognizant with bias and ethics was ensuring that I included everyone's voice into the findings and into my recommendations. So the projects that I've done recently for the city of Denver have involved interviewing a lot of different stakeholders. So officials within the city, city council, community members, registered neighborhood organizations, just a number of different stakeholders, and trying to make sure that everyone's voices was included in a meaningful way. So not check the box community engagement or inclusion, but actually doing that meaningfully. And then in teaching, again, it's transparency and understanding that there's bias built into just deciding what classes to offer, how to teach them. Do you go very broad and include a lot of different topics on an issue, or do you take a more focused approach and go more in depth? And the answer to that can depend on the nature of the class. Is it a summer class or is it a 15-week class? And so to me, that level of academic freedom in terms of choosing what I'm going to cover and then within each topic, what materials I'm going to include, that academic freedom comes with a big responsibility. And I just try to be really transparent about what I'm doing and why, and what I'm also not doing. And so I do what I can to acknowledge my bias. I don't know that I can always completely like get rid of it. But I feel like the best I can do sometimes is acknowledge it.
So Sheila, can I just class on serial killers?
Yeah. So, yeah. So I'll just say really quickly that as a researcher, I think it's really important when I teach research methods and statistics is that as a researcher, our first thing is to ask a research question. And we call it a research question because it's a question. And it's a question that we want to answer. And then we're going to figure out the best way to gather data to answer this question. It is not about having an answer and then trying to gather information to support the answer we started with. And do we see this out there with people who call themselves researchers? Yeah, we do. But that's not the way that I operate. And each person just has to be guided by their own integrity and honesty. People who've been in my class they're probably pulling the string going like, no data are perfect, no research is perfect. And that's really true. And that's a part of acknowledging it. But asking a legitimate question you're seriously seeking to get an answer to better understand something, that's what research is all about. And anybody doing anything differently isn't doing research.
Thank you so much. We are at time, so that does conclude our panel for the evening, but thank you all again for coming today. If you have any follow-up questions, please feel free to let me know. I can let all of our panelists know. We have connected people via email in the past, so if there are more questions, don't hesitate to reach out, and thank you again so much.